everybody. I think I'm going to invoke my chair's authority and call us to order here. My name is Joseph Howley. I'm an associate professor of classics here at Columbia University, and it's my great honor and delight to have been invited to chair this panel on weaponizing the classics. I have the honor of introducing our three speakers, whom I will forewarn at the first that I have been sternly admonished to keep you to 8 to 10 minutes. So if I start shifting in my seat and clearing my throat, that's me keeping you to 8 to 10 minutes. No, that's me telling you that we're over 10 minutes. Let's see, I think we've decided we're going to proceed in the order seated from the table, right to left, which is also the order of reverse institutional distance from this room. So I'm just going to start out with very brief introductions. Brian McGing recently retired as Regius Professor of Greek at Trinity College Dublin. His publications are too many to name, but relevant to today's talk, I suppose, is his 2010 Polybius' Histories. He tells me he's working, or is near completion of a new lobe of Appian, something sorely wanted. That's very exciting. And that after the last of the new lobe volumes, which there are 3, is turned in, he'll be turning his attention to unpublished documentary papyrus rolls from the Chester Beatty Library, which is also very exciting to me. With that, I'll invite Brian to speak first.
Right, thank you. Does this make a difference? It does, yes. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here in Columbia. I go on longer about that, except we've only got 10 minutes, so I better get cracking. The classical world of Greece and Rome should never be seen as a repository of solutions or self-help advice for the problems of the modern world. It is a repository of types of engagement with human problems that can provide the modern world with lines of investigation and different perspectives. Probably the most dangerous misuse of the classical world has always been as a source of justification for whatever it is you want to think or do as an individual or state. And the record of using classical models for this purpose is not an edifying one. It has justified, or been used to justify much of modern imperialism and war, slavery, the oppression of women, racism, and many other things. On the whole, rather than providing blueprints for action, the most useful lessons from the classical world, I think, are warnings. Some analysts, you might recall, memorably used Xenophon's Anabasis to give authority to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. But the Anabasis tells the story of a gung-ho invasion of Iraq to effect regime change, a military victory, failure to find a convincing government to replace the previous one, and an extremely difficult and bloody extraction of the invading force, all with no obvious beneficial effect for anybody, which all sounds somewhat familiar, I would have thought. It's hard to imagine a clearer sign for the Bush administration with "danger, beware" written all over it. What Xenophon should have provided was not his imprimatur for invasion, but a pressing invitation to address the question: if we do this, why will our actions have a different outcome this time? How to deal with the misuse of classical models is perhaps a bigger problem than ever, and at least for 2 reasons. I blame, first, postmodernism. This word, of course, has a huge spectrum of meaning, but one of its manifestations in the field of historical studies was an extreme subjectivity and refusal to prioritize evidence. Anything I say is just as valid as anything you say, regardless of the evidence or of our qualifications for assessing it. In the field of history, this extreme subjectivity eventually foundered on the rocks of the Holocaust, but I think it has survived and made its way into general and political discourse. It seems to have stopped mattering what President Trump says, or what manifest lies the Brexiteer politicians in Britain have spouted, the response is, I don't care what you say, this is what I say and I'm right and you're wrong. The second exacerbating factor which feeds the acceptability of this political dishonesty is of course social media. Anyone really can go public and say more or less whatever they like, however ill-informed or vicious. So when the good old boys of the Red Pill Brigade grossly misuse ancient philosophy, of it or whatever it is, the response to Donna Zuckerberg's brilliant and brave refutation in Not All Dead White Men is either to ignore her or to abuse and threaten her, and in either case almost certainly not to bother reading what she wrote. I don't know that we can do much more than what Zuckerberg has done, and in our teaching and public engagement as classicists, honestly present our case for why and how we believe the classical world matters and why it cannot be used as an instruction manual. As this workshop is about modern politics, I wanted to say something very quickly about an ancient political expert, the 2nd century BC Greek historian Polybius, who wrote a 40-book study of Rome's rise to power, is in the modern world best known for his analysis of the Roman constitution in Book 6. What particularly influenced John Adams and other founding fathers in the 1780s was Polybius' analysis of Rome's mixed constitution, that balance of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy that the founding fathers thought they were introducing to America, coupled, of course, with the separation of powers and representative government. But Polybius had other things to say that the founding fathers didn't pick up, and I want to mention two of them very briefly. First, his cycle of constitutions that Machiavelli reproduced, the way that each of the main types of government, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, gives way to its corrupt form, tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule, which is then eventually replaced by monarchy, which restarts the cycle. The cycle is hardly convincing to the modern world, but the transitions from one form of government to another are perhaps more suggestive. The collapse of democracy into mob rule, when Polybius says people forget the past and no longer value the benefits they have had, doesn't seem to me to be without resonance in the modern world, where we seem to be rushing to forget the past as quickly as we can. And the transition from monarch to tyrant illustrates perhaps the main point I want to extract just very, very briefly from Polybius, and that is the strong connection he saw between the abandonment of successful policies and the decline of government. This works at both individual and state level. Philip V ruled Macedon from 231 to 179 BC, started out his reign as successful and popular with all the Greeks. That gave him prestige, authority, power, but then with his treacherous and murderous attack on the town of Messina, he completely reversed the policies that had brought him success in the first place. And he met with hostility, failure, and his reign went downhill in interesting ways we won't go into now. At the state level, Rome took certain actions that Polybius saw in the same light, I think. He thought, I believe, that Rome was in decline. In 211, for instance, in the course of the Great War against Hannibal, Rome captured and plundered Syracuse. They stripped the city of all its art and ornaments, and Polybius thought this was a mistake. If they had become great by doing this sort of thing, then it would have been the way to continue. But in fact, they'd lived a simple life, far from such luxuries, a rather rose-tinted version of Rome's past, and had been constantly victorious over those who possessed such things. To abandon the ways of the victor and imitate those of the conquered is surely an incontestable error, he says. I think it's quite a strong theme in Polybius and needs more detailed unpacking, but like to the United States at the moment, it's interesting, an ambiguous message. As President, Mr. Trump has clearly continued in exactly the same mode that got him the presidency in the first place, and his best route to re-election, in Polybius' view, I would imagine, would be to continue doing what he's doing, and he seems to have every intention of doing that. I think it's perhaps unlikely that he secretly reads Polybius at night, but you never know. At the state level, however, Mr. Trump's determination to abandon or at least seriously weaken the network of alliances and leadership roles that America has undertaken since the Second World War would be for Polybius precisely an abandonment of the very policies that have made the United States the most powerful nation in the world, and it would be, I think, for Polybius, an incontestable error. To finish, what does Polybius add? Analysts have come up with some of these things. He adds the authority and angle, I think, of one of the great analysts of political power and government in the Western tradition. It's an authority not to tell us what to do, but to make it well worth our while to examine it carefully and critically and see if it helps us to think about the world that we face. The founding fathers found Polybius of central usefulness, and I think actually he has a great deal more to offer the modern world, but as a participant in current political discourse, not as a guru to be followed blindly. Thank you. Is that time?
Perfect.
Yes.
That was precisely time. Thank you so much, Brian. I should have said at the outset that we're going to have each of our speakers speak, and then we'll have questions and discussions afterwards. I made the mistake of asking my friend Daniel Padilla-Peralta, who's assistant professor of classics at Princeton, to send me some upcoming publications, which I could advertise here, and if I would take up his whole 10 minutes if I were to read them. They're all very exciting. Divine Institutions, Religion and State Formation in Mid-Republican Rome is coming out 2020. 338 BC, Rome and the Beginnings of Empire, co-authored with Dennis Feeney, is under contract with Harvard for a due date in 2021. I should add, given the venue, that an essay on lexicography and epigraphy in Augustan Rome that I'm very much looking forward to, that Daniel said he started working on when he was a fellow here at the Society of Fellows several years ago, is finally coming out this year in an edited volume from CUP called The Cultural History of Augustan Rome. But perhaps most exciting, well, they're all exciting, but most exciting is that Daniel tells me he's written an introduction to a new edition of Robert Graves' The Golden Fleece, which is out next week. Is that right? That's fantastic. Head down to Book Culture and order your copy today. I won't take up any more of your time. Daniel?
It's green! All right. Thank you so much, Joe, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and all of you for being here. My remarks today for this panel are intended as a follow-up to a paper with the same title that I delivered at the January 2019 meeting of the Society for Classical Studies for a panel on the future of the classics. During the open question and answer session, a member of the audience performed a racist speech act whose contents I won't reprise here. This incident, coupled with the racial profiling of two scholars of color at the annual meeting, has spurred several classics departments throughout the United States and classical studies associations on both sides of the Atlantic to issue statements of solidarity and, in some cases, to begin the more difficult work of confronting white supremacy's many spectral forms in the historical and contemporary study of the cultures of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean. And in response to the presentation of data on the gross underrepresentation of scholars of color in several of the field's flagship journals, the American Journal of Philology recently published an editorial statement expressing its intentions to diversify its contributor base. Editorial boards at other classics journals have also been re-examining their protocols and, in some cases, actively striving towards diversifying themselves as a preliminary to promoting a more equitable system of knowledge production. Despite these promising moves, the uphill climb will be a steep one. The field has arrived, I think, at a potentially irresolvable crisis. That word, yes, crisis. The necessary work of dismantling white supremacy within classics will depend for its full realization on the empowerment of scholars from marginalized and minoritized backgrounds and of differentially embodied perspectives, and yet that empowerment is conditional on first recognizing that white supremacy and structural inequality pervade every domain in the field, which is a difficult if not impossible undertaking when those in prime positions of power are blind to, or worse, preoccupied with protecting the benefits that they have reaped from white supremacy. Further amplifying the scope and seeming intractability of this paradox, if not heightening its absurdity, is that within those progressive circles that are mobilizing around the idea of promoting a more equitable classics, being a white ally comes with cachet and can open doors to professional recognition. This isn't the same as saying that white allies perform wokeness only in furtherance of the pursuit of honors. Let me be clear that I don't think this is the case. Nor should the cost of allyship be minimized, since those allies whose work has been indispensable to expanding the horizons of possibility in classics have been regularly on the receiving end of disgusting and vile threats, as well as other forms of toxicity. What I want simply to put on the table for now is that the work of allyship reifies and reproduces an unequal structure of professional visibility and recognition, in as much as, one, allyship translates the privileges of whiteness into a commodifiable performance that can then be assessed and valued, potentially by an employer or professional organization, and two, the rewards of allyship remain conditional on the continuing sidelining of people of color and other marginalized groups, since the ally retains recognition only as long as she can speak on behalf of those communities that are being silenced. At the same time, though, allies have to shoulder this work because those scholars from historically marginalized groups who do establish a presence in the field are regularly worked to within an inch of their lives, and sometimes at the cost of their lives. My short answer to the prompt to thought that is folded into the title of today's panel is that the classics are weaponized because they invite weaponization, and that the agents and ministers of white supremacy in particular have gravitated towards the classics because the field itself, as a construct of knowledge and as a system of authority, these two are not actually separable, beckons invitingly to them. A more aggressive restatement of this idea would be that the classics have been and continue to be weaponized because they do not exist independently of weaponization. No classics exist out there in the Platonic universe of forms that is not already seared with the brand of violence: structural violence, systemic violence, epistemic violence. There are, in my view, at least three reasons for this, each of which I will name and briefly outline in the remainder of my time with you today. The first is that for all the determined work of responsibly disposed and progressively oriented allies, the face of the field in Euro-American settings remains legible as white and is likely to remain so for at least some time. Without taking sides in the James Baldwin, Ralph Wiley, Teju Cole triangular debate about who claims ownership of those cultural productions that are marked with the signifier of the West, let me simply gesture in the direction of some general trends in publication and representation that won't come as a surprise. As I tried to show at the Classics annual meeting in January, journal publication overwhelmingly privileges white authors. A small group of quantitatively minded practitioners has in recent months been discussing scaling up to a field-wide study of trends in publication, with an eye not only on the journals, but monographs and edited volumes, the entire economy of publication. Some foundation-setting work on this front is confirming what many of us have suspected. Not only do Euro-American white academics dominate publication of classics, even after we adjust for the fact that classics are white, hashtag, it is likely that they are significantly overrepresented. If we pull up the first 100 titles recently published in forthcoming books from Oxford University Press, I count 4 authors who are not white Euro-Americans. A few others may identify as hailing from minoritized groups, but I would wager that you will not clear 10 authors, even according to generous criteria for inclusion. Performing the same exercise in the first 100 titles for recently published in forthcoming Cambridge University Press books yields between 3 and 6 authors from historically marginalized groups, depending on how you count. And this game is easy to play with other publishers. The same proportion of white to non-white authors holds for the recent run of publications out of Harvard University Press, in the 2018-2019 Ancient World Publication Catalog of Princeton University Press, you won't find a single scholar of color, and so on. This matters because, well, at the risk of stating the obvious, publication is the gateway to recognition and visibility, and publication is implicated in the reproduction of the face of the field. The second reason I want to name is that the field is nowhere close to a comprehensive decolonization of its knowledge production practices, although important steps are being taken on this front by Catherine Blouin and others. One specific manifestation of the resistance to decolonization was the acrimonious response that greeted Martin Bernal's Black Athena, a text that has not been re-engaged as a catalyst to imagining afresh the history of classics as discipline, nearly to the degree that it perhaps should. The near total veiling of the ethics of knowledge as a contested or contestable space in the history and present practice of the discipline is another index of the resistance to decolonization. Scholars in other fields have recognized that the generation of knowledge is not some unqualified good. Not infrequently, one precondition for the production of knowledge is the partial or complete destruction of other forms of knowledge. Classics has played fast and loose with the ethics of knowledge, pretending either that the generation of knowledge about the cultures of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean is a good without need of further justification, or that the preservation of that knowledge, already produced and transmitted, does not implicate the field in any structural harms. I think neither of these is true. Not far removed from the continuing absence of a field-wide decolonization is the third reason, which is the refusal of prominent institutional stakeholders, and in many cases the students they train, to recognize the multidimensionality of the problems they encounter. That the escalating and destructive shift to contingent labor, for example, operates within the same force field of neoliberal subjection as the continuing exploitation of women, people of color, LGBTQIA, and differently abled folks in the field. And that ultimately there can be no direction towards an emancipatory practice of the field that doesn't organize itself around an intersectional analysis. Some of this refusal is a residuum of the professionalized mystification that knowledge work is not, work. That it's a passion or a life dream or what you love doing more than anything else in the world. But this is a passion that will demand everything from you, that will require sacrifice. The cost of embracing this affective orientation towards classics is the internalization of a set of a prioristic dispositions that prove very hard to shake down and shake off once one is committed to equity work. Why are people falling out of the field? Well, perhaps they didn't love it enough. And critics of the field, well, they don't love it enough. The tensions and frustrations and inequities of the field are all reducible to one affective state, with little to no consideration of the structural realities that funnel people into and out of the field. As many of you involved in or engaged with labor movements on this and other campuses are aware, another reflex of this sentimental economy is the unwillingness to credit, except when maximally advantageous to power holders, the operations of an economy in specifying and regulating the resources available to the most vulnerable members of the economy, graduate students and contingent labor. The predictable outcome is share-inducing paternalism or worse. Why don't members of the precariat understand that we, and by we I mean those with security and authority, have their best interests at heart? What on earth could possibly be motivating them to organize collectively for unionized representation? It's just a minor thing that many of those organizing are from groups marginalized in or underrepresented within the contemporary academy. It's just an accident. Let me conclude for now. Classics is weaponized towards illiberal, racist, anti-democratic ends because the institutions of the field are locked into colluding with that species of weaponization. The only hope is a thorough and rigorously theorized reinvention of the field, and even that may not be enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janelle. Our last speaker is Marcus Fulch, Associate Professor of Classics here at Columbia, my colleague. He's the author of The City and the Stage, Performance, Genre, and Gender in Plato's Laws, which came out from Oxford University Press in 2015. And he's working on a new book right now on the emergence of prisons in the ancient Greco-Roman Mediterranean, which I've had the pleasure of having many conversations with him about, entitled Bondage, Incarceration, and the Prison in Ancient Greece and Rome, a Cultural History. Marcus.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for the introduction, and to the organizers for arranging the invitation, and of course to the audience for sitting through this. I'm taking this panel as an opportunity to explore a series of questions that began to formulate themselves into a focus of critical inquiry in 2012 in a seminar that I taught on classical reception in the 20th century novel after James Joyce. We, the students and I, were constantly grappling with a triangulation of concerns that pertain to the classical tradition as it has been constituted for the past century. Classics as an academic field defined by by and as the historicized study of the past within its own terms, hence historicism in my subtitle, classics in the popular imagination as European cultural heritage on the continent, and in the New World as colonial heritage, a repository of symbols, arguments, and institutions whose authority is rarely questioned, except today, and contested, and which functions to legitimate and naturalize a system of colonialist domination and resource extraction, hence the politics in my subtitle, and classics as a literary character and identity, the classicist, a particular kind of trope that emerges, or perhaps I should say who emerges. It was never quite clear to me whether the classicist is a literary fiction or a historical fact or some combination of the two, repeatedly in the 20th century novel, in 20th century art and film, hence ethos in my subtitle. And the question I'm asking is, how are these coordinates, classics as an academic field, popular conceptualizations of classical heritage, and the notion of the classicist, how are they codependent, and what are their political valence and operations? And I begin not in the past, but in the ruthless present. In a recent episode of Comedy Central's Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, entitled White at the Museum, where we find the Lucas brothers, Kenny and Keith Lucas, twin American law school dropouts turned comedians, exploring the fascination among white supremacists with classical antiquity. The opening clip includes a montage of posters featuring, for instance, Alexander the Great, with the subtitle, "Let's Become Great Again," the smug voice of former Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard David Duke urging his audience to just, quote, "go look at the Greek pictures, and that's you," end quote. And a video of a Columbia University student, I couldn't help myself, outside Butler Library, just below the name Sophocles, shouting, "I love white people, I love white men, we did everything," end quote. So the Lucas brothers go down to the Met, quote, "to learn about the ancient history that white supremacists love so much," end quote. There they meet Marco Leona, the David H. Koch scientist in charge. And now I'm enough of a post-structuralist, to believe that hegemonic symbolic systems mystify themselves, but at the same time leave traces, keys to their own decoding. And so I note that David H. Koch is indeed that David Koch of the Koch brothers, millionaire architects and financiers of the conservative capture of the American political system. Now, Dr. Leona informs the Lucas brothers that Greek and Roman statues were not white, but painted to reflect what people looked like in the streets, to which they marvel. Basically, we could have avoided racism if the Greeks just used some primer. From White Lady Sarah, that's a quote, that is Sarah Bond, professor of classics at Iowa, they learned that the Greeks and Romans had no genetic notion of race. They saw skin color but did not use it to enforce relationships of political and discursive domination. From Peabody Award-winning assistant professor of journalism at Rutgers, Dr. Chanjarai Kumanyika, I'm sorry if I butchered that, we hear that, quote, "whiteness is not skin color, whiteness is a system of oppression." First they start organizing the statues, and then they start organizing the institutions, education, criminal justice, all around whiteness. To undo this world that whiteness has created, we must learn to see the past in full color, end quote. The Lucas brothers take this as a cue to drop acid-laced museum stickers and go on a night-long trip in the Met, now animated in wild polychromy, a trip that includes a conversation with a Roman statue of bearded Hercules, not Heracles, on whose buttocks are tattooed the names Megara, scratched out, and just below it, Deianira. Hercules is, of course, incapable of understanding what racism is, and he asks if they can help him find his broken penis. As they exit the museum, we hear the brothers muse, quote, "I guess history is way doper when you see it in color, and when you're stoned as fuck," end quote. Okay, so Full Frontal is not only topical and delightfully derisive of the earnestness with which white supremacists seek to appropriate and weaponize classics, it also raises and parodies what I take as the central ethical dilemma of this panel. What resources do we, as professional scholars who know that classical antiquity looked nothing like what the David Dukes of the world would like it to look like, What resources do we have to combat this pernicious image? And how might the very institutions that were organized to enable whiteness as a system of oppression be mobilized to deconstruct and replace that system? A panel on weaponizing the classes is, inter alia, an invitation to interrogate identity politics. For what seems to be at stake in the online furor is ethnic identity, or at least notions thereof, its historical grounding, its symbolic legitimacy, and mobilization as a political strategy. So I ask, does classics, in its depoliticized, or not quite so depoliticized, but depoliticized professional constitution as an academic discipline have an ethnic identity, offer an ethnic identity, and if so, how is it connected to the ethnic identity or identities which white supremacists make claims to by means of classical imagery? As always, Mary Beard is helpful. Mary Beard, who has recently taken on a new role as the preferred punching bag of the progressive arm of the discipline, takes stock in an essay entitled "Do the Classics Have a Future?" Of literally hundreds of books, articles, and op-ed pieces written since 2000, all of which in their different ways lament the death of classics, conduct an autopsy upon them, or recommend some rather belated life-saving procedures. The essay is revelatory in its combining claims of transhistorical continuity, enduring loss, and ever-present longing. Continuity. Beard calls attention to what she calls, quote, the inextricable embeddedness of the classical tradition within Western culture, end quote. There are, of course, she concedes, and this is another quote, many other multicultural strands and traditions that demand our attention, define who we are, and without which the contemporary world would be immeasurably poorer. But the fact is that Dante read Virgil's Aeneid, not the Epic of Gilgamesh. If we were to amputate the classics from the modern world, it would mean more than closing down some university departments and consigning Latin grammar to the scrap heap. It would mean bleeding wounds in the body of Western culture, end quote. Importantly, the expression multicultural strands and traditions appears just before what J.L. Austin called the irrelevanting but, the but that serves to dismiss everything before it. But the fact is that Dante read Virgil's Aeneid. The multicultural which deserves study and without which we would be impoverished may be part of us, but is not inextricably embedded within Western culture as Virgil, or at least not in the same way. So, loss. Mary Beard observes that echoes of the contemporary anxiety over the imminent demise of classical learning may be heard within the discipline at numerous occasions in 1948 Browning version, for instance, or in Postgate's Latin, that is Cambridge Latinist J.P. Postgate's 1902 essay decrying the decline of Greek and Latin at Cambridge, and in Thomas Jefferson's justifications for the prominence of classics in his curriculum. The truth, Mary Beard says, is that classics are by definition in decline. Even in what we now call the Renaissance, humanists were not celebrating the rebirth of classics. They were for the most part engaged in a desperate last-ditch attempt to save the fleeting and fragile traces of classics from oblivion. Longing. All of this rhetoric of loss from the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, Mary Beard claims, seems, quote, almost preposterous to us. For in our terms, these were the voices from the golden age of classical study and understanding. But they are an important reminder of one of the most important aspects of the symbolic register of the classics, that sense of imminent loss, the terrifying fragility of our connections with distant antiquity, always in danger of rupture, the fear of the barbarians at the gates, and that we are not simply up to the task of preserving what we value, end quote. Mary Beard makes clear, as Mary Beard makes clear, longing desiderates not only nor principally classical antiquity, but a particular fantasy of the classicist. Quote, the sense of loss and longing is, for the culture of the distant past, the fragments of papyrus from the trash cans of Oxyrhynchus, but not solely. The sense of loss and longing is also for our predecessors, whose connection to the ancient world we often believe to have been much closer than our own. Now, I happen to be fascinated by the figure of the classicist, this predecessor of mine, whose presence is always slipping away, this ideal, this object of almost erotic desire. And I think that unless we comprehend and historicize and theorize the aspirational ideals of our discipline, the models of self upon which its laurels hang, the ethos its students are invited to emulate, the ideological operations that ethos serves, will have left unexamined a significant dimension of classics as a field of contestation. Where else does this figure appear? In their 2001 volume, Who Killed Homer, Hansen and Heath make recourse to a strikingly identical rhetoric of continuity and loss. Continuity posited against multicultural strands. First, they say, Greek wisdom is not Mediterranean, but anti-Mediterranean. Hellenic culture, an ideal not predicated on race. Notice that they also note that the past is not concerned with, the classical past is not concerned with race, is not just different from, but entirely antithetical to any civilization of its own time or space. The core values of classical Greece are unique, unchanging, non-multicultural, and thus explain both the duration and dynamism of Western culture itself, end quote. Loss. Second, they argue, the demise of classical learning is both real and quantifiable. And third, that's a quote, longing. Our present generation of classicists helped to destroy classical education, end quote. The barbarians, sorry, John, will be done in just 2 seconds. The barbarians at the gate are not only Goths and Huns, the Parthians, or the Persians, but the wrong kind of classicists. And where might we discover the right kind of classicists? They say classical scholarship between 1800 and 1920 reached its zenith with the assistance of the disciplines of archaeology, epigraphy, and numismatics. Compare Mary Beard's golden age of classical learning and understanding. So, the slide from Hansen and Heath to white supremacist appropriations of classics is easy and one suspects programmatic. But, and irrelevant in but, it is just as easy to slide to Mary Beard's nominally anti-conservative conceptualization of the discipline, change up the politics, overcode the classics as part of a progressive multicultural politics of the present, go for a trip to the Met to see Greek and Roman statues in psychotropic hypercolor, and the cultural epistemology of the discipline, which makes it appealing to racist appropriations. These things remain uncontested and intact. And with apologies for going over time.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all our speakers. I'm reminded that on the day to which Danelle alluded in January at the meeting of the Society for Classical Studies, the day concluded with a major address to the Society by Professor Beard, a scholar whose work I was assigned and read with glee and inspiration as a graduate student, in which she, she admonished the discipline for an excess of historical critiques of its own situation in systems of power and oppression, which she referred to as comfortable self-flagellation. I have also heard the term virtue signaling, and it sounds very similar. But more importantly, I think Professor Beard informed us all that classics, although it has been politicized, does not have a politics. I think what we've heard here today is a discussion that should certainly put that notion to rest, but I think also asks us to think about why it might be desirable to assure ourselves that the discipline does not have a politics. I think anyone who studied, say, critical theory in graduate school can easily identify that to say something does not have a politics has a politics. I also think that it's worth thinking about here about the fantasy of the Platonic domain in which things have no political implications or no consequences. I'll open the floor now to comments and questions. Yes, please.
Well, to say the classics doesn't have a politics is absolute baloney. Because anybody who studies how British colonial administrators are trained, I can think of all the scholarship I've read in the late 19th century, the classics are the basis for them to be imperial rulers. So this is a ridiculous baloney kind of argument that's made. And I have emceed in the past 25 to 30 years debates on Bernal, with Bernal there and Lefkowitz sitting there fighting with him. And I'm sort of curious about that debate, because I myself was interested to be a classicist many, many years moons ago. I was attracted by Greeks and the Irrational, which I thought was just a mind-boggling book. Because you talk about Samantha Flood having painted statues, well, of course, that's one of the big things it argues in the book, that all these statues we see that are blank now, the Christians decided to purge all the multicolors of the statues. And we've seen in the past 50 years in this country the complete weaponization of classics by the right. So where's the left in all this? Where's the radical scholars? Because I can see using the classics in all sorts of creative ways to really make people think. And I must admit, I've never seen too many people of color being classicists. You're one of the first guys I've ever seen in my life. And
I wonder why.
Yeah, exactly. But any person I knew who was an African American, they're not going to study that 50 years ago. They're going to do other things. So it's fascinating to hear these kind of perspectives now. But where are we at in that issue?
Well, so I'm hearing two questions out of you. One is sort of representation within the field, and I should say that I have the pleasure here of teaching undergraduate Latin classes that are very racially and ethnically diverse. So if you wanted to ask why I see lots of people of many backgrounds in the classroom and we see very few of them in faculty positions, then we have to think about structures of discipline in some of the ways that I think Danielle was asking us to think about. But then it sounds like you're asking a second question, which is how might we, could we, should we, is anyone weaponizing the classics in the other direction, right? So Danielle asked us to think about an emancipatory practice of the discipline that is rigorously theorized. I think here we run up against the notion that I think is conventional within the discipline, certainly from a liberal standpoint, that one ought not to do such a thing, that would be inappropriate, because to politicize is somehow intellectually dishonest and perhaps even morally irresponsible. I wonder what our panelists think about this.
The right doesn't care about that.
Yeah, that's certainly true.
I should note, I mean, this is not apropos of Joe's intervention here, but I simply did want to follow up on one strand of your question, which is that Professor Beard at the SCS plenary lecture did attempt to maneuver around classicist was an instrumental catalytic factor in the education of the architects of British Empire. Here was one of the arguments. I am not parodying this. I mean, the talk is online. You can watch it. She said that many of those Oxbridge-trained folks did not go on to rule the empire. They became county parsons and stuff like that. So this argument was met with derision in some circles. I think Marcus is correct to point out that both Professor Beard and specifically that lecture have been punching bags for some of us, because the argument miscast the operations of empire. I mean, the idea, for example, that the operations of empire could work internally and externally seems utterly alien to her line of analysis, right? But I bring this up only to note that in thinking about the efficacies and the potentialities of classics as a site for the articulation and furtherance of imperialist, colonizer, and racist projects, there is a tendency, a very pronounced tendency, to assume that such work operates beyond the practice of say, scholarly activity in classics, right? It's sort of at the margins. These folks get educated, they leave Oxbridge, they go somewhere else, they perpetrate violence in those places. The institutions that are responsible for the production of knowledge are not immediately linked to that production. It's all done by people who are educated there and then left. Right? But the invitation, as I see it, of this panel and of other moves recently to interrogate the work of classics is to disavow this line of thinking. Right? To say, well, what happens if we begin to come to grips with the fact that the work of violence is taking place in the practice of scholarship right here, right now? And that I think is the more meaningful, the ultimately the more rewarding, if by necessity the more challenging aspect of this work. Oh, I turned it off and off.
Thanks to the panelists. And I'm sorry, I was at a musical event last night where I bought a T-shirt that said "fuck fascism." I wish I'd worn that. But gave a little bit of a lefty kind of thing. I started studying Latin when I was 12 and Greek when I was 16, and taught Greek and Latin at the university level in the 70s, and then felt that it was incumbent on me to make some money. So I did. So I went into the business world, which had absolutely no qualifications, so I made a shit ton of money. And when I had enough money, a few years ago, I said, thanks very much, but I had enough haircuts for one lifetime, so I left and went back to teaching on an occasional basis, teaching Greek and Latin downtown at Fordham, and was impressed. And my Greek, in particular, which was my first one, and I kept up my Latin. I kept them both up. I kept the languages up all those years of wearing suits and ties. My Greek is still pretty good. It's good enough to teach. I'm impressed coming back to the academy with, and pretty good at languages, the immense amount of time it took me to get even respectable with Greek. It took me 10 years easily before I felt comfortable. And I can honestly say that I've started working my way through Homer again, just very, very, very slowly. Because one of the joys to me about teaching undergraduates whose Greek is crap is that it forces you to go really, really, really slowly. So I'm sort of interested in the context of some of the things that you gentlemen have been saying. The amount of time that needs to be invested to acquire any kind of respectable mastery of the languages, which to me is foundational. I mean, history is great, antiquity is great, archaeology is great, all of that. But the languages are so immensely time-consuming to develop a facility and a real resonance for it. I mean, how do you deal with that as a political question? How can you convince somebody to invest 10, 15, 20 years of their life to become good at the languages and then take it from there? Fellas?
Yeah, well, actually, I disagree with you about how long it takes. I think that's to a certain extent an inheritance from past assumptions that if you didn't start Greek when you were 9, you were pretty well lost. Those were the assumptions when we started it in Trinity College from ab initio, from beginning, and it was assumed that this was a kind of a lost exercise. Really, that they'd never come up to speed. I'm absolutely convinced that people can learn Greek and Latin rapidly. We have 4 years, and at the end of 4 years, if you've learned Greek from the beginning, I always felt that it was possible to become adept. Obviously, the more you read, the better you get, but so I mean, my answer is that it might have been your experience, but it's not a necessary one. I think students can learn quickly and do. They have to have an ability, I think, but that's that's our experience anyway.
Yes? You all agree with that? Because it's, as I say, I'm drawing obviously on idiosyncratic personal experience. And yeah, I knew the declensions and conjugations by the time I had finished my undergraduate degrees. I'm talking about being able to pick up Polybius or whoever and read it with the ease that you would read the newspaper. It took me a long time to get there.
I can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I there is a facility that I think gets fantasized in the discipline in the classroom that few of us achieve with any ease. I think part of what Brian is getting at is that there are many different ways of teaching the language, and some of the ways of teaching these languages have not changed for some time. I think that one of the important words in your question is mastery of the language. Why is it that so much teaching of ancient languages is still premised on it taking a while and still built around essentially a concept of mastery, a system and a structure in which students must work very hard to aspire to an authority that their teacher imposes on them? And what are the dynamics in the classroom that creates? This may come back to our earlier question of why do people leave the field? Why do people who enjoy studying it as undergraduates not pursue it further? So I think that, I certainly know that there are instructors in our classics department here, many of whom are graduate students at the early levels of the languages, are very involved in new ways of thinking about teaching languages. That is where you will find the forefront in the creative thinking about how to teach ancient languages. Those new ideas or renewed ideas in the classroom are themselves not always immune to problematic politics and problematic disciplines of gender, race, and power in the classroom. But there are people in this one who are interested in changing how we think about teaching it and how we frame that kind of ideal. I don't want to dominate if you guys have opinions on this, I'm curious.
No, I would only add that I do think it does take time to learn the ancient languages. I don't think that should be denied. And I also recognize that there are ways of accelerating the study of languages and innovative developments being made. I guess my concern is that if the discipline of classics is constituted such that the languages operate, I think which is what you're saying, as a kind of barrier to anyone who doesn't have extensive amount of leisure or something like this, then in fact the discipline is doing something wrong. I even hear in your statement the sense that there's a kind of hierarchy that privileges a certain kind of linguistic ability over knowledge of historical processes or material artifacts or things like this. And I think that needs to be interrogated and addressed. That would be one point, that the discipline would need to reconceptualize what it considers legitimate preparation. And the second point is that if we are going to maintain this kind of barrier threshold, then we would need to develop institutions that, particularly in the American context where students are coming to the classics in their junior year or in their sophomore year, we need to develop a set of institutions that make it possible to spend even 4 years developing an adequate level of Greek and Latin, if we're going to maintain that. And I don't think that we should. So,
I'll just very briefly want to note that I recently was speaking to an enthusiastic college senior who was looking at graduate programs. I asked them how long they had been studying Greek and Latin. They said, I started Latin when I was 9 because my mother thought it would impose discipline on me. And I found that very telling.
let me just add, I started classics in my junior year. Okay, so there are cases of people who started.
Yeah, I don't doubt it.
Yeah.
So I just first have to say how much I enjoyed all of the presentations, and I'm particularly interested in the turn in the panel from weaponizing the classics, contemporary political discourse, towards the classics as a weapon. I'm not a classics scholar, sadly. In my discipline of English literature, there has also been a lot of recognition that English studies is, frequently used as a weapon. And is weaponized, and I tend to think, or I tend to feel, I guess, that the mobilization of English studies as a tool of empire has to do with the emergence of non-philological studies of English in the university setting at a particular historical moment, late 19th, early 20th century. And that the development of the curriculum of English studies in a non-philological context has been so hard to take apart and is so much a piece of the way that English studies is used to propagate stories about empire. I wonder, given how much longer classics has been part of international university curricula, I would think it would be much better. I would think that revisioning the curriculum would be more possible, or that, but I don't know how the institutionalization of classical study in your field is also bound up with the weaponization of these. If that makes sense as a question.
I think it's harder to dismantle, frankly. And I think that classics as a curriculum is a very fixed idea.
Is that happening at all? Is there? Is that a thing?
Yes. Yeah.
A conversation is starting to begin to happen.
Yeah.
I think that's
It's just an American perspective. What you were saying we have very peripheral contact with these problems in Ireland, which is mostly single nation. The number of non-white European students that we've had it would almost be zero apart from American visitors. So the politicisation of classics, I think, in Ireland has had much more to do with religion and the role of Trinity College, and Greek and Latin was a weapon for protecting privilege, I think. And the introduction of classics in translation, or emphasis on material culture, has had a huge effect, I would have said. And it was quite revolutionary when it was introduced. We introduced it first in Trinity, and were highly criticised by other colleagues in the country. You know, Trinity's going down the drain. You're abandoning the fundamentals of the discipline, and I thought that was complete nonsense. There are other things to study beyond the language. You can do a huge amount in translation, and material culture often needs science far more than it needs language. I mean, I think there are different conditions in different places, and the situation in Britain, I would say, is again different. I mean, there was obviously a huge element of privilege there, in that it was classics was preserved of the public schools, the ultimate private schools, of course. And Ireland's never had quite that. There are some privileged schools that have always been associated with classics, but in Ireland it was a religious thing, because it was the language of Christianity. So it was Greek and Latin were in fact a form of resistance to British rule ultimately. So it's a different. I sense anyway a very different perspective. Yeah.
I mean, I would add to that. Oh, Lynn, do you want to?
No, go ahead.
I mean, my only addition to this is that I think different conditions obtain in different national settings, but what I have seen to be true on both sides of the Atlantic is an unwillingness to engage in the kind of disciplinary history that would bring to the center the historic and ongoing complicities of the field. And these complicities are operative at the level of the technologies of knowledge that are devised in the field. I'm going to give two examples of this. So the first has to do with the history of the technology that is textual transmission studies, which from the mid-18th century, really from the 19th century on, is signed and marked with language that is strangely reminiscent of language from racial science. All this stuff about contaminated manuscripts, for example, or contaminated traditions, I should say. And some people have now sort of talked about this. I mean, Michael Reeve wrote an article some time ago in which he began to sort of connect these dots in a pretty compelling way. But this is an element of the practice of classics as a mechanism for producing and reproducing knowledge that is uncomfortably entangled with other disciplinary formations, including markedly and explicitly racial ones, right? The other one I'll signal for now is papyrology. So, some years ago, news began making the rounds that there was more Sappho. Oh, how exciting! There's more Sappho. This is great. And in due course, new Sappho poem was published, and this is very exciting. But several scholars, among them Roberto Mazza and others, had zeroed in on the question surrounding the provenance of the papyrus that, in fact, contained these verses of Sappho. And it turns out that we are now, thanks to some of the discussions provoked at that juncture in time, in the midst of a far more wide-ranging conversation about the relationship between the historical evolution and contemporary practices of papyrology on the one hand, and forms of highly exploitative extraction of materials from Egypt and other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean on the other, right? But again, this is not, I think, to be classified as sort of peripheral to the functions of the discipline. This should actually be central to it, but because of the production of a certain kind of affect around the new sample. Aren't you so excited that there's new sample? This is so great. We should talk immediately about the text, as if the text would somehow be decoupled from the circumstances of its retrieval and reproduction. We find ourselves in this bind where it becomes easy, once again, to overlook the complicity of this technology with forms of exploitation.
There's one question in the back, but I don't.
One thing I was going to say, go back. So when we were first putting together this panel, it wasn't specifically about Greek and Roman classics. We were trying to think about the ways that myths or that were a deep part of the stories and classical myths that were deep in certain cultures, let's say the Ramayana or something, right, were being used by particular political groups at different moments, that it ceased to become a kind of bonding myth for a group of people. It became a divisive one, right? So that was sort of about the weaponizing. When did, so I would like people just to respond to this, when was it, like in this particular period, when the classics became not like part of the core curriculum where everybody reads homework, and where people like David Duke says, it's ours and not theirs. I'm trying to figure out how it gets weaponized from being the thing that binds everybody together, that divides them.
So that's a time question,
Yeah.
which is, I heard Donald Zuckerberg speak earlier this year, and really the weaponization of the classics is not coming from the university. It's coming from self-educated people who are saying whatever they want to. And I find it similar to what's going on with the attack on science, where science is being attacked by uneducated people, and scientists are beginning to form a strategy to get out there and combat this. And I'm wondering if there's some kind of strategy going on within people like you to get outside of the university and to go out and meet these people where they are and engage them.
Yeah, where's the cause?
I'm just going to say something very quickly while it's on my mind, because I will forget otherwise. I don't know how best to put this politely. I'm not into the game of othering this work as simply the work of self-educated folks who don't know what we educated folks know. I'm not into this for several reasons. One is that it is re-inscriptive and reiterative of forms of elitism that I feel my progressive politics and ethics force me to disavow. But I think actually the problem is even more insidious than this. So, in a way, the opening salvo gestured in the direction, and he just left. Damn it. How many folks of color do you see in the faculty ranks doing this kind of work in classics or related humanities disciplines? You don't see that many. In some disciplines, some subjects of classics, you don't see any at all. So if you are in the position of attempting to read the sort of configuration of authority within the field, if, say, you are shopping around for a book or books, and you come across all these books written by great white men at Oxbridge or at Princeton or at Harvard, what is there to prevent you from thinking that this is, in the Dukean sense, yours, and that it is yours in a specifically indexical way, i.e. this material works to certify that the reproduction of this knowledge that is signed as classical is actually the prerogative of a specific cisgender white male system of power. This is why, for me, the question of how the discipline works or fails to work in advancing the cause of equity is so bound up with the weaponization of classics, right? Yes, there may very well be these extra university actors who do this particular work, aided and abetted by, in some cases, some very well-funded conservative organizations. We should talk about the sort of parallel processes of institutionalization too. But they get some of their material from the facial and the sort of concomitantly the indexical property of how classics is organized in the 21st century moment. And how the classics as a field cultivates certain affects, how it projects an image of itself, right? And how, and now we get back again to the first question, how absent a sort of concerted or organized effort, how absent a concerted, organized, liberal progressive effort for rectifying this is at the highest levels of the field's organization. Right? So all of these play a role. But that's why I sort of resist the framing of your question. I acknowledge that your question has some validity because obviously, in the case of the incident I referred to at the end of the meeting this year, this was an incident that featured an independent scholar who was not affiliated with the university. But it became, as I pointed out in conversation with some folks afterwards, all too easy for people to say, well, she is extrinsic to the academy. She doesn't belong here. I mean, people really resorted to highly ableist language too. She's mentally ill, so you should ignore her. I mean, like, these bear poorly, and they represent us poorly, these sort of discursive modes of distancing, because they serve ultimately to convey the fiction, to convey something that I think is hardwired in the current state of the field, and that is that our field is nowhere near as inclusive as it should be.
But Dal, Donna Zuckerberg's response to Red Pill, do you think that's part of the problem? I don't see what else she can do but confront gross distortion, and that's separate from what you're talking about, isn't it?
So I believe that she has done what she can. She has realized in doing the work that she has fulfilled, she has met a very exacting ethical and disciplinary standard as far as I'm
But it doesn't do anything to address what you're talking about.
Yeah, but let me put it a different way. So some time ago, I had a conversation with a Latin teacher who had taught at a Title I school, was now teaching in the charter system, white middle-class background, had gone to a state institution for his undergraduate classics training, and then had gone to another state institution for his master's training and his PhD. And we had this conversation in which he foregrounded all the good work that he is doing. And then he said, well, but what should I be doing more, especially for students of color in my classes? And here's why I faced with a challenge, because my first and reflexive response was to say, well, you are limited in what you can do because you are not a person of color. And that's not to say that he can't do efficacious or meaningful work. It is to say that so many of the conversations about the kinds of efficacious work we can do seem to me predicated on the idea that, well, what matters is that somebody be doing the work without attention to what the embodiment of that person is. Like, it actually really does matter that for students of color, you represent to them, that there are people like them. And I don't think this is just a sort of trivial point about, say, the pedagogy of representation. I think this has profound consequences for how authority is organized in any field, right? So that's why, I am incredibly grateful to Don's work. But my comments about allyship at the start of my paper were intended to foreground the degree to which the work of allyship will, to a large extent, reproduce structures of power in the field unless we acknowledge that it is absolutely vital to the future of the discipline that more and more people not just get trained as classicists, but that they actually have the institutional support to remain in a field that is very toxic to them for all kinds of reasons.
Thank you. I'm sorry to say that as chair, I have the great responsibility of cutting off my colleagues and the responsibility to ensure everyone in the audience gets their caffeine. So I believe there's coffee in the next room.
There is, and we're running behind. There was supposed to be 15 minutes between sessions, so just let's take,
Actually,
let's just take 7.
Okay, kick off again at 3:55. Thank you all so much for coming, and let's thank our speakers one more time.